Hello, good morning. I'm Tamsin Rose, the moderator for this session, and welcome. We're delighted that today sees the launch of the EU Agricultural Outlook, which is a medium-term projection looking forward to 2030, and it explores issues around farm income and resilience. You can find out more about it and download it from the conference website and from the DG AGRI website. I'm delighted to introduce the person who's going to give us some of the highlights so that we can understand the perspective looking over the next 8 years. Because as we heard from the previous speaker in the previous session, there are only 8 harvests left until 2030. So let's explore a little bit about what we can expect and what's coming in terms of our agricultural sector. And I'm pleased to introduce the person who's going to give us those highlights. It's Mr. Tassos Aniotis, who's the Acting Deputy Director for DG AGRI, and who's going to give us the highlights. Tassos.
Thank you, Tamsin, and good morning, everybody. Admittedly, this is the most difficult Outlook exercise since we went public in 2015, and I'm not talking here about only the COVID crisis situation. As we speak, the ink is not yet dry from the publication of the new CAP legislation, and market developments make many macroeconomic assumptions we had to make only a few weeks past already doubtful. To address the challenge when setting the scene, I opt to cover in a telegraphic manner 3 topics. A very rapid look into where we're coming from and what lessons we derive from this, where we see things going if nothing changes, and what to expect from the ongoing changes that need to be further analyzed. With the theme of the conference resilience, it is important not to lose sight of the gains made by EU agriculture during the past 3 decades, a period characterized by successive reforms of the policy framework within which EU agriculture operates, starting from, but not limited to, the Common Agricultural Policy. Could you please move the slides? This is not functioning. Okay, these gains are reflected in the resilience showed by EU agriculture and its capacity to adjust. All this, not just in the shifting policy scene of agriculture, trade, food safety or environment, but with crises of animal diseases, food scares, major commodity crises, trade embargoes, and the recent pandemic, to name a few. To summarize, these gains are clearly and continuing in economic terms, but progress is slow and mixed in the environmental front, where a clear need for significant improvements led to the new orientation of the Common Agricultural Policy. You heard it already too often, and just before by our Commissioner. This orientation aims to raise the level of environmental and climate ambition and better link the policy to measurable impacts related to its stated objectives. Unfortunately, the new CAP could not be part of the Outlook published this morning, as we follow the rule of the annual exercise of OECD and FIO, to which we are part, of introducing policy changes once already in place. With CAP strategic plans not yet submitted, it would have been impossible to integrate the new CAP in an outlook that will cover the next decade. This will have to wait for the next Outlook conference. So what is the merit of this exercise? Some have already asked. It is exactly to indicate, with all the caveats that such exercises entail, one possible path of the future if the CAP did not change and present trends continued, a no-action scenario, if you want, and to derive from it relevant lessons for the future based on what happened in the past. You have most likely all seen this graph, which summarizes the change in policy measures from successive CAP reforms in the context of more member states and budgetary constraints. On the left axis, you have in billion euros the expenditure of the CAP. On the right axis, in percentage of GDP multiplied by 100 as a share of the EU budget, and all the changes in the policy measures we had over the years. The question that is often asked is, and what did the CAP do for the EU agriculture with all this money? It contributed to the significant increase in EU farm income, the result of increases in both volume and value of EU agricultural output, and the result of an impressive agri-trade performance, all of the above, in the context of the same WTO environment and market environment that all our partners are to face. But as in so many other sectors, results were more mixed in the environment. This slide shows greenhouse gas emissions from EU agriculture, which summarize so well the impact of economic activities, and from this slide, three messages clearly emerge. Global greenhouse gas emissions from EU agriculture declined significantly in the early years of reforms and enlargements, but have since stagnated. Per unit greenhouse gas emissions keep declining, indicating efficiencies and lessons that need to be explored and understood so as to facilitate transition, and further significant progress is needed since both greenhouse gas commitments and impacts are at global level and not at per unit level. All these messages are pertinent for the future CAP and its implementation. This is more so since judgments about its potential impact are often made without necessarily drawing the lessons from efficiency gains of many best practices. This necessary progress will not take place in a vacuum, but in the concrete environment of the present commodity market upheaval. Climate, energy costs, and other uncertainties set a market background with similarities with, but also significant differences from the 2008 commodity boom. Some market trends provide a prelude for the future developments, even when policy assumptions are reflecting a status quo baseline. And on the ground, a knowledge-based agriculture proves the key to future success, though gaps remain in knowledge transfers and in the perceptions about science. If we look at the commodity price waves as we've seen them in this particular graph, what we know is that volatility is back, and with it comes a more combined high level of prices and co-movement of all commodity prices. Sounds familiar? Yes and no. As this time around, the decoupling of gas prices from oil prices introduces additional pressures to an energy-dependent sector such as agriculture. In the first 11 months of the year, the World Bank data set indicates that energy and fertilizer prices grew 3 times more than agricultural prices. With the extent and duration of this boom unknown, one can only monitor and take note and look at 2008 notes for inspiration. Looking more closely now into some of the outlook highlights, and especially at the cereal supply side, cereal yield growth continues to slow down and in wheat and barley to stagnate. These long-term trends clearly indicate that what could happen will not only depend on future policy changes, but will also reflect the impact of a multitude of factors from climate change to gaps in research and technologies. In the livestock sector, on the left side graph, the decline in the dairy herd will help in reducing emissions even before policy changes take place. Yet the expected doubling in the organic cow numbers to reach 9% of the herd by the end of the period will certainly help on the ground, but not necessarily in statistics. You see, when it comes to methane, a cow remains the same cow, whether it is inside or outside, eats grass or compound feed, with or without feed additives, at least for the moment. And one would like to hope that we will change this analysis at some point. On the right side of the graph, what you see is the total per capita meat consumption, which is expected to marginally decline, driven by further growth in poultry by another 6% in the next 10 years, after a 20% jump during the past decade. Beef and pork are expected to continue a similar decline with the past decade, -7% and -5% respectively, over the whole period, though their contribution to a more balanced diet is often ignored in simplified approaches on the causality of the multi-factor link of food and health. Finally, let's move to the soil, the most accurate test of agriculture's footprint, since when good things happen in the soil, good things happen in the air, in water, and in biodiversity, and vice versa. The regional EU map on the left of the slide shows projected nutrient losses without policy change, while the map on the right, measuring the change of these losses, indicates the potential for progress in some regions, even under the current policy, as well as the increasing pressure in other regions. What to make of all this, especially with respect to how a resilient farming sector can become more sustainable than today? The most important lesson is that what needs to be done is already present on the ground. On the supply side, where a healthy competition among best practices demonstrates that economic and environmental efficiency can be complements. On the demand side, where trends point to required production adjustments, though the complexity in determinants of taste and preferences is often forgotten. And at global level, where climate change realities facilitate policy refocus, and where distinct regional experiences could help in the search for the right mix of ambition and realism. But I think I'm entering into Beth's territory here, and thanking you, I will stop. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Tassos, for outlining, as you said, one of the most difficult moments to be reviewing the current state of agriculture in the EU. And you highlighted some of the key pressures that are facing farmers. And I was particularly struck by the fact that in the last 11 months, the price of energy and of fertilizers has increased 3 times, and we hasn't had the same change in prices for agriculture. So that's an enormous pressure for farmers to deal with. And I know this is an issue that we'll be picking up later when we explore the question of resilience. But now to comment on what we've just heard and to make the context to the global picture, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. That's Beth Begdal, who is the Deputy Director General for the Food and Agriculture Organization. And as Tassos has mentioned, the EU Agricultural Outlook is part of a global process of monitoring what's happening in agriculture. Beth, you've just heard the highlights of the new report that was published today. Do you see the same trends globally? Is it a similar picture around the world?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Tamsin, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you to the European Commission and to Tassos, a longtime friend and colleague, for the opportunity to share a little bit with you about some of our views. Indeed, our global outlook work is closely linked with the EU's outlook, and as you've said, very much tied to our upcoming projection exercises that we will be conducting jointly. And I think I'd also like to stress that I couldn't agree more with Tassos's comment about the importance of needing right now real ambition and pragmatism or realism, along with a deep sense of commitment to change agri-food systems. It's really time for, I think, transformation of food, health, nutrition, energy, and climate systems in order to achieve the 2030 agenda and also the Paris Agreement. We've all watched the recent UN Food Systems Summit, the COP26, and I think we have recognized there's a reconfirmation of the urgent need to adopt a systemic approach to bridge the agenda on climate, on health, on agriculture, and food. With less than 8 years to go now, all stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, development institutions, farmers and their organizations, private citizens, civil society, all need to act to step up our common efforts if we are going to meet these global food security and sustainability targets. And I think more than we've recognized even yet, COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of our agri-food systems. But the truth is, I think as the data showed in Tassos's presentation, the pandemic hasn't been solely to blame for many of the productivity and other supply and demand challenges that global agri-food systems are facing. More to the point, it exacerbated a number of aggravating factors that already exist: conflict, humanitarian emergencies, the climate and environmental crises, but also systemic value chain weaknesses, or even gaps, we might say, and also ongoing economic slowdowns and downturns. So as we step back and look at the overall global food security situation, we are really concerned about the continuing crisis that is emerging, with as many as 811 million people being undernourished in the world today. 3 billion cannot afford healthy diets. And I really want to stress this particular point in today's conversation. I think it is incredibly critical that we focus more on issues of nutrition or malnutrition that accompany these concerning hunger and general food insecurity trends. Our projections show that if current nutrition patterns persist, there will be a challenging evolution of diets over the coming decade. In low-income countries, nutrition will remain largely based on staples and sweeteners, with low levels of protein, high levels of fat, and healthier diets out of the reach for many. In middle-income countries, consumers will increase their food intake most significantly, and maybe with a preference for livestock products and fish. And in high-income countries, consumption of animal protein is expected to level off, with consumers increasingly replacing red meat with poultry, dairy, and other alternative products. So global health outcomes are heavily influenced by these diets. And this is an area where I think as we look worldwide, we recognize very alarmingly that fats and staples are expected to account for about 60% of available calories by 2030, whereas fruits and vegetables, in contrast, only 7%. So we need to not only find ourselves in a place where we are paying attention to the overall food security environment, but that we are really working to achieve more when it comes to healthy and nutritious diets. On top of that, we now find ourselves in a very worrisome food, health, climate nexus, with a clear climate crisis underway. Global greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are concerning and are projected to increase over the next 10 years. And as Tassos mentioned, we are increasingly realizing that more is required to protect our soil, our water, our air, and biodiversity. So to tackle all of these different topics, productivity improvements will have to account for the ways that we ultimately address these challenges. And we're going to have to do all of this more sustainably. It's an absolute imperative. If we continue operating as we do today, we will continue to face hunger and malnutrition over the next decade, and we will not achieve the SDGs. Without significant modifications to the current global strategy, around 660 million people could be living in hunger in 2030. At FAO, we are determined to work with all of our members, partners, and stakeholders to really bring this kind of multi-dimensional and transformational change to the agri-food systems. We're focusing on better production, better nutrition, better environment, ultimately to bring a better life and to ensure that we leave no one in this world behind. So it is indeed the time to not only re-examine these trends, to understand them, to understand their foundations, but it's also time to really recommit, I think, our collective actions to ensure that we can bring about the kind of change to achieve the 2030 agenda. And I believe that this year's EU Outlook report will be yet another incredibly valuable contribution to this overall process.
Thank you very much, Beth, for setting out a very sobering picture of the global trends and the impact, and just reminding us how much of the world is facing food insecurity and linking that to the current state of the world, so humanitarian issues, conflict, and other issues that are driving this. So clearly agriculture exists in this policy environment. Tassos, let me bring you back in, because as you've said, farmers have had a really uncertain 24 months, but farmers deal with uncertainty all the time with the climate changing things, but it's been extraordinary, the pressures we've had, labour market disruptions, supply chain disruptions, COVID-19, etc., and the changes in the volatility of the commodity prices. Where do you see the highlights in terms of resilience? What are the bright spots that you can point out for us that you see could point for a positive direction by 2030?
Thank you for the question, Tamsin, because it gives me the opportunity at least to try to put a positive spin also on some of these things. As one colleague mentioned to me yesterday, we tend not to smile much in these agricultural outlook conferences, but we need to find also some bright sides. You pointedly out correctly that farmers know very well what uncertainty is. And they know very well that from time to time, some of this market uncertainty will not last a few months, that might last a few years. In my personal view, it's not the market uncertainty that is the biggest worry that they have. It is the policy uncertainty that is the biggest worry that they have. That's why it's extremely important to have a policy framework that is stable and within which they know how they need to operate. What is extremely important to keep in mind is that right now, and I mentioned it at the end of my presentation, on the ground, we have very concrete evidence of many practices that manage to combine an increase in economic and environmental efficiency at the same time. What we don't have, however, is a bridging of these three broad areas of knowledge gaps that we have mentioned and discussed in the past. There is new knowledge that needs to be generated, and that comes from research. And usually it takes some time for it to come. One of the biggest projects we have in the future is the soil mission, where more research is expected to provide us indications of what we have to do in order to improve soil management. But already on the ground, knowledge exists through innovation, and it is the transfer of this knowledge to farmers that is missing. And here is where it's extremely important, at least in the context of the European Union, to move very fast in improving the farm advisory systems of member states. And finally, there is a significant issue that we have to address, which is perceptions about knowledge, especially perceptions about science. What we are seeing right now in the debate about vaccines on COVID, we have seen it in agriculture about the application of various technologies. And we're seeing in other parts of societies. And I think we need to address with concrete examples the costs and also the benefits that come in different best practices, and we have to do it on the basis of evidence and concrete numbers. And if we focus much more in exchanging this knowledge, I think it will become much more clear that we don't only have a grim environment right now, but we also have bright spots that indicate what we have to do to improve things in the future.
Thank you, Tassos. Beth, let me turn to you, because of course you've mentioned COP26, and climate is an increasingly important part of our political agenda. You mentioned the food and health and climate nexus, and there's also the digital transformation, which is changing the way that we do business, but it's also opportunities for farmers. If you look at those three big elements, which is for the climate, we need to produce more but using less inputs. And then we have the digital transition that may give us new opportunities. What does this mean concretely for farming communities around the world?
I think you've identified, as Tassos mentioned, maybe one of those areas where we should really be thinking about bright spots. And I think as we really do explore the opportunities for transformation of farming practices because of new digital related tools, this is the space where we can really, I think, bring significant productivity enhancements, bring more information, bring more knowledge, bring change to the way that even policies are enacted in various countries to ultimately improve these global food systems. This is an area where we see tremendous opportunity for one very, I think, important region of the world, which is Africa. And I would just like to point out that while we do very much take a step back and look at these global trends, when we really do look at the continent of Africa at the moment, it's increasingly concerning and alarming that we're losing ground in really trying to bring better production practices to small-scale farmers and their communities on that continent. We're seeing food deficit issues continue to rise. Climate is increasingly a problem in so many countries. The transboundary pests that have emerged, especially in the eastern horn of Africa, and have been devastating. Overall, again, productivity just continues to go in the wrong direction. And on top of that, we only have approximately 7% of the entire continent that has been vaccinated. So for us, really ensuring that we tackle the climate issue, we think about new tools that can bring better practices for not only farmer knowledge, but also production practices to those farmers. This is an area where I think we can really scale and invest in science, in technology, in human capital. And this is where we see a real opportunity for FAO and our members to really make, I think, a significant contribution in training and understanding what the right kinds of digital and innovative tools could be to support the farmers around the world. This is an area where we need to be especially mindful of not getting caught in really being, I think, focused on cutting edge next generation technologies and innovations. Sometimes it's the most practical and maybe even some of the more traditional innovations and knowledge resources that need to be applied. And so we can't lose sight of the importance of contextualization, of adaptability, and also affordability for these different types of innovations.
Thank you, Beth. And as we're coming towards the end of this session, I'm going to ask both Tassos and Beth to reflect for a moment and answer one very simple question. Agriculture is a sector that's perhaps less well known by people who are not involved in the everyday farming and food production process. So what would you like other people, other policy sectors to think about or to know when they reflect on agriculture? So Tassos, if you wanted to talk to colleagues in other bits of the Commission who say their priorities might be the digital transition or climate or energy or something else, what would you like them to know about the agriculture sector? And Beth, I'll come to you in a second.
Well, I think it's rather simple. In all human basic needs, whether it's food, whether it's shelter, whether it's energy, whether it's transport, we face the same problem. We need to combine economic and environmental gains this time around without putting at risk the social dimension of sustainability. So the important thing to keep in mind is it all starts with food. Without the production of food, we cannot address all the other basic needs. That's the first thing that we need to keep in mind. And the second thing that we need to keep in mind, and it's not only the bad stories, but it is the good stories that should help us look at the big picture, because from the good stories we can also learn what we need to do in order to make the bad stories move away.
Thank you. Beth, you've been talking throughout our session this morning about the need to connect our food and agriculture to broader social, economic and political themes. What would you like people to think about or to know about the agricultural sector?
I fully agree with the conclusion that Tassos made, that it does. Everything we do on this planet starts with food. It's at the very foundation of life as we know it. And what I would just add to sort of conclude our session here is that I am highly encouraged by the visibility and I think the understanding that is continuing to come across many segments of the population as we now move from beyond talking about the agriculture industry, the agriculture sector, production agriculture, value chains. This concept of systems, of food systems, of agri-food systems is really beginning to take hold. And I think a number of us need to recognize that sharing this kind of information and gaining this kind of global understanding, especially with policymakers, takes time. You don't issue a single white paper or an issue brief that all of a sudden changes perceptions about what the food and agriculture system can ultimately bring and how its interconnections and linkages to so many other parts of the economy are clear. And so I think with the focus on the UN Food System Summit, the COP, the Nutrition for Growth Summit, the direction that so many of our efforts, including those taking place inside the EU right now, are beginning to take us, I think, further towards this global recognition that we really are needing to put agriculture and food at the center of so many of these other global priorities. And I think we're making great progress there. It's very encouraging.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you, Tassos, for sharing your insights with us. A reminder for those in the audience, the brand new EU Agricultural Outlook document has been published today, and it's available for you to download on the conference website at DG Agri website. Please go there, look at the document. You have a lot more detail, some of the pictures that you saw, the graphics, and a lot of context and information to understand where the sector is going and some of the pressures of the last 12 months. Thank you, and I'm closing this session.